Hello, I'm Roger Williams. I've been working as a social worker and as an interpreter for about 40 years with the deaf community. My wife is deaf, 4 of my children are deaf, and I am particularly interested in communication and in when that communication goes wrong, when there is disfluency, when someone's challenges with acquiring and using language become of such severity that they impact how we interact with them, how we might assess their cognitive skills or their psychiatric status, and what kind of things look wrong and how we can deal with it, and what maybe some of the things we can do to do a better job of assessing that. So what's important is to remember that what doesn't get said is just as important as what does. So I'm often looking for what's missing. Even though I certainly think of myself as a strength-based person, I want to be looking at what's not there, what pieces of communication skills are more of a challenge, but then also I do want to look and see what skills the individual does bring to the communication task. So, having said all that, let's then look at the next piece of that. Some of my basic biases. One is that, as I. King Jordan said, deaf people can do everything except hear. And then, perhaps somewhat conversely, it's important to remember, as Mark Marshak also pointed out, that deaf children are not just hearing children who don't hear. There's a lot more going on than this part. We really are more interested in this part. And so, while yeah, deaf children can do anything except hear, that not hearing impacts how they learn language, how they use language, and that in turn impacts all of the work that we get to be doing later on. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it's taken place. I'm doing this in spoken English. I could obviously also sign it. And I am making the assumption that what I'm saying is being understood at the other end. I don't actually know that. So that's my illusion, that communication is taking place. And certainly in a setting like this, where we're kind of broadcasting it out to the world, it's not unreasonable for us to not know what's being said at the other end. But one-to-one, often I see situations where both parties think that communication is taking place, and yet later on, it turns out that it doesn't. Kind of a story I often tell, for which my wife may not be happy for me to tell to this larger audience, is that one day she went to work. She worked at the Corps of Engineers. She shows up for work, and there's nobody there, which is a little unusual because the Corps is kind of rigid about attendance, and she's waiting. And then she remembers her boss opening the door the night before and saying, and she, don't forget, we're going to be late. So she waits, waits, and after an hour, gives up and goes home. So the next day she goes to work, and of course what happens? Everybody says, including her, "Where were you?" To which George responds, "Where were you?" And they said, "We told you, we were going to be at the lake." The Army Corps of Engineers, being who it is, owns lakes, and they were at there counting lakes, whatever they do when they count lakes, but they were there at the lake, and she thought that they were going to be late. And so the problem wasn't that they didn't understand each other, but that they both thought they had understood each other. And that's really critical when we start looking at language and how people think. So when we talk about language and thought and which is which and which came first, the chicken or the egg, let's kind of go back a little bit to an early psychologist, James Watson, who thought basically that language and thought were one and the same. And this is a perspective that goes way back. Part of the reason why the offensive term deaf and dumb came around was because to lack the power of speech was to be thought to lack the power of language, and without language you lacked thought. So even as sign language came on, then people thought you needed a language to think. And so the fact that language and thought were basically the same thing was assumed for really up until fairly recently, that you couldn't think without language, and that if you thought, and if you had language, then you thought. So then Piaget sort of said, well, no. Thinking comes first, and then we structure language from there. That first we get the ability to, we have these thoughts, so we think about things, and then language develops from that thought process. Well, and then somebody else said, no, maybe it's the other way around. That first we have to have language, and then because we have language, we can then structure our thoughts. We can have thoughts only because we have the language first. So this is Pat Seipel, and her perspective was that thinking about stuff required the language to store, to process, to remember, to find that thought. So she saw language as essential, and of course we know that all children, deaf or hearing, are born with the capacity for language, but that until that language was developed, thoughts didn't really have a way to get going. And then we have good old Chomsky, who basically said that, well, there's language and there's thought, then they're not at all the same. You can have one without the other. Those two things kind of exist, not independent by any means, but that one is not dependent upon the other to be formed. And that's, I don't know. To be honest, I'm not sure. There are times when I see language as so essential, but I also know adults who lack a formal language system, but they still have a language. And so when they have thoughts, are they in their informal language structure? It's hard to know, and it's hard to ask them, because without a shared language, we don't have a way to have a conversation, to talk about our thoughts about language without language. So maybe this is just a theoretical conversation, but what do we know? A, language starts when? You know, on my slide I know it says it starts at birth, but what we actually know is that it starts before birth. Some new research on children in the womb who respond at 1 to sounds they heard only in the womb. So we know that language acquisition and the recognition of sound and all of that starts very, very early on. At the very latest, it starts at birth, but it probably starts sometime before then. And we're wired for language. Our brains just yearn for that ability to think about, to have a structure, to have a way to process our thoughts, to organize our thoughts. So all of that comes from that first structure for language. But it doesn't start until you get exposed to a language. So, you know, this confusion between language and speech and communication, because clearly speech is not language. A couple of my children have essentially no speech. They've never said a word. They don't make sounds. Speech just isn't there. This is just not a skill that they have or want to have. Yet clearly they have language and they have communication. So we know that language and speech are not the same. But it does raise the question for one of my children who was 6 when she joined our family. What did she have before she joined our family? She had no exposure to sign language. She had no exposure to a language that was accessible to her. So, did she have thoughts? I can't answer that question. But she certainly didn't communicate to others. She didn't point. She didn't gesture. She was very much kind of steered and pointed in directions, and people pushed her places and she went places, but she didn't express herself about what she wanted or what she wanted to know. So until you get exposed to a language in a way that you can understand it, whether it be sign, whether it be on the lips, whether it be what you hear, whatever it is, or what you feel in the case of somebody who's both deaf and blind, but until that language is presented to you in a way that you can access it, your brain doesn't start to develop it. You know, they looked at those children like the wild boy of Aviran or the elephant girls in India and wanted to find what people's natural language was. And of course, what they discovered was there was no such thing. That if you have a child without exposure to language, whether they're deaf or hearing, and very rare with hearing children, unfortunately all too common with deaf children, but without that opportunity, the language doesn't start all on its own. So what do we know about hearing kids is that language kind of starts out a little bit slow and then just really starts to pick up somewhere around 2 to 3. It goes from kind of being like this to being like this. And if you've ever had a child in your house at that age, you know they kind of go from single words and maybe even a couple of 2-word, 3-word phrases, and then all of a sudden they're yakking. And as the father of 6, I can assure you they don't stop at any particular moment in time. But it goes up very quickly, and they just take off, and they go from slow language acquisition to fast language acquisition, and they really just start to play with language and use language and express themselves. So what do we know about deaf kids? Well, we certainly know, as you can see, there's a wide variety in where people are on this little chart. That you have some kids, probably those who are in homes where there is not access to a visual language of whatever ilk, all the way up to the children who have access to a visual. But what you see is kind of this slope up. It doesn't seem to make that little turn, and we really don't know why. Lots of people have lots of theories, as you can well imagine. Maybe my personal theory, some of that is that incidental learning. So much of what we learn is from stuff that's going on around us, not stuff that we're actually getting directed to us. And unfortunately, for many children who are deaf, that incidental information doesn't get transmitted in the same way. They don't have the radio in the car going nonstop. They don't hear the TV. They don't hear the conversation among the other people in their environment. Even if those other people are signing, they may not be looking at that conversation, whereas the hearing child is hearing that all the time. So what we know is that definitely, yes, deaf children acquire language, and that at that same age they can do many of those same language tasks. But it doesn't seem to go up quite so rapidly. But that's important that we also know that, yeah, deaf kids have sort of a normal acquisition of language. We can expect that from birth until whenever they get exposed to that language, they're going to babble. You have deaf kids who babble in sign. They will babble, you know, ba 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 ba. They make all the fun sounds that 1- and 2-year-olds make. Starting as early as 9 months, we're going to see them taking some basic signs for concrete objects. Milk, that seems to be a popular one, at least in my house. Cracker, although for some reason my grandchild seems to sign it cracker. I don't quite know why, because we taught him cracker. But anyway, he signs cracker, and bread as opposed to bread. But he clearly is telling me he wants bread. As you can probably guess, if you've ever talked to a 1-year-old, most of these words focus on food, and then not too long before no becomes the word that they like to use. So as early as 18 months old, we'll start to see 2-word phrases and signs that are not using those basic hand shapes, you know, the A and this and this and this and this. They're going to change from that to using some of the more complicated signs. You know, you'll see T starting to show up for a bathroom, of course, but you're going to see signs that are using some of those non-basic hand shapes. They're going to start doing that. Sometimes for that child who's really in a good language stimulating environment, they're going to respond to, you know, what questions, where, what, all of those kind of things are going to start showing up. They're going to start to use facial expression within their communication because, as you know, that's an important element of ASL. So they're going to be showing that use of facial grammar in their communication, starting as early as 2, and then, you know, about the time they get to 3, you're going to start seeing directional signs. You know, I give you something, you give me something. somebody gives to somebody else. They're going to start understanding that sign can be manipulated in space in front of them, and some very concrete classifiers. You know, the one person walking by or the one person using legs. You're going to start to see some of those very basic classifiers starting as early as 3, and then about the time they get to 4, you're going to start to see true ASL grammar showing up, non-manual markers, you know, the cheeks, the eyebrows, the different elements of ASL are going to start showing up as they get to 4. And then obviously as they get older, 5, 6, and 7, you're going to see an increase in vocabulary. And one of the things is that it's important to understand that that's what normal is. That's what a child should have. And if they don't have that much language, so if you get a child who starts school at 6 with nothing, they are significantly behind. They're 5 to 6 years behind. And that lag, yes, can get made up, but it takes a lot of work. And one time I went to an IEP conference, and the IEP team was very pleased because this deaf child of 8 had 25 and 50 words, and I pointed out that my deaf child of 8 had about 1,000. And they said, "Oh, no, you don't understand, this child was adopted." And I pointed out, "Well, so was my son." And they said, no, you know, he has ADHD. And I said, "Well, you know, it's funny you should mention that, so does my son." And then they said, "Well, you know, but he came from a really difficult background," and they described some of the problems. And I said, "Well, that's fascinating, but so does my son." And so they didn't know what was normal. So it's important to know what is normal as you move forward. So, what do we know about this neural development, this plasticity? You know, we're always fun of saying little kids are like sponges, and as a grandparent, sometimes they seem a little spongier than others, but they have this neural plasticity for language until about 3 or 4, when a little part of the brain changes over from being an auditory receptive area to a visual receptive area. And so this is really kind of key as they start to pick up that language and they start to understand things better. And this kind of flips over. Incidentally, they do these experiments on deaf cats and see the same pattern. There's this little tiny part of the brain that swaps from one to the other to the child who doesn't hear and doesn't use auditory language, somewhere between 3 and 4. And as a social worker who's really interested in the patterns of attachment and how kids make those trusting relationships to caregivers in their environment, that non-linguistic attachment, the attachment that is not dependent on language, it's dependent upon a parent showing up when there are needs, whether it's hungry or tired or wet or whatever the many things that 1 and 2-year-olds complain about. They are there to provide that that respond to the child's need, and then that, of course, develops into a secure attachment. And we can see that even in children who don't have language, who aren't exposed to language, we can still see secure attachment patterns in the right brain and the development of kids as they get older. So all of these things can happen whether there's language or not, but clearly without language, some of the later tasks are not going to happen as we would like them to. So, what's the social and emotional impact of all of that? First, that those of you, as you can see clearly, I'm an Ericksonian in my looking at developmental stages, and also need to thank Dr. Meadow from Gallaudet, who adapted kind of Erickson's basic structure, looking at deaf kids. So, you know, that first task of trust. How do you develop trust? You have to know that, hey, this child doesn't hear. That if I yell, I'm going to be right there, or, oh, you're, you know, hungry, hold on a minute, let me go get you some food. If that doesn't happen, some of those basic trust and tasks don't develop. So even though I said you can have a secure attachment without language, at the same time, it gets a little harder. because maybe they don't know that you are responding to their need until they're like, you show up with food, but it might be sometime later on. So maybe more of a difficult task. Obviously, as we get a little bit older, we hear this whole concept of, I had a child I was working with who was a little bit older, but when they were 2 or 3, they got out and they got into fights with peers, which, if you know, 2 and 3-year-olds is not all that unusual. But the family had decided that it was because they were deaf that they were getting into these fights, and so they kept him home, and he never went out and played. So he developed that shame base that something is wrong with me, that I am disabled, that I am not able to do things because I don't get to do the things other kids do because I'm deaf. So that whole autonomy versus shame, and then, you know, as you get a little bit older to 4, moving up into 4 and 5 and starting school, we start to, you know, people tell us no, and then they tell us why now. No, you can't do that. It's not nice. Other people will be upset with you. If you steal things, then nobody will have things and people will steal your things. So we start to internalize those norms. But that takes a lot of explanation, and that takes language, all of that, to grasp that. So you may see older children who don't have some of that understanding about why we do things, because early on they were told no, they got the no, because believe me, you know, even if you don't sign, you're pretty well sure when your mom and dad are telling you no, but they don't know the why. And then, of course, we get to school, and one of the challenges with school is that ever since the Rowley decision, basically kids have to fail before we provide appropriate education. And because without that, we don't know that they need the IEP process and all the fun things that you guys deal with so much. So without that, so that when they're at the time when the child is needing to develop competency, we're requiring them not to be competent so we can provide what they need. Maybe not the best system. Of course, you know, as they move up, we get into 12 and 13 and into teen years and all those fun and tasks when kids are not just asking, am I a boy or girl, am I attracted to boys, am I attracted to girls, whatever it is that's going on with me, I also try to figure out if they're deaf or they're hearing. People always get a little bit confused by that. One of my kids, who can call me on the phone, just a regular hearing phone, and ask for money, as long as I say yes, he understands me just fine, but he clearly identifies himself as deaf, although he can hear pretty darn well. But he thinks of himself as a deaf person. His girlfriend is deaf, he goes to the school for the deaf, he goes to a deaf college. So they have to define that role, and then as they get older, then you have to struggle of trying to find a partner. And that's very difficult when you're talking about a low incidence population. Finding either somebody who's also deaf, which is, of course, most deaf people marry other deaf people, but increasingly, they might be marrying a hearing person, but then how are they going to communicate and how are they going to accomplish that task? So, we know that there are things that sign languages are good for, things that spoken languages are good for. It seems that having spoken language seems to help you with doing some sequential, some temporal processing. It helps you with some memory tasks. It helps you do some of the things that, maybe because of the linear nature of spoken language, there's this piece and then this piece and then that piece, for whatever reason, and I'm not going to try to hypothesize as why. We just know that it does seem that having spoken language competence, whether you hear or not, is connected to having that ability to do a better job of processing things in order and in structure. We also know that kids who, that some of the academic tasks, many of those related to reading and to the use of English, seem to be easier for some kids who have spoken language fluency. Obviously, this is a very hotly contested, and you could have any one of 1,000 people who would all tell you all different things about this question. But there does seem to be some tie-in. Now, it's not definitive. Obviously, there are deaf people who don't have spoken language fluency, who are extremely literate, extremely successful in academic endeavors. But as a group, there seems to be some relationship between those two. There's also some issues related to employment mobility that whether we like it or not, employers sometimes are more willing to hire individuals whom they perceive to have spoken language fluency. But that's only about 25% of deaf kids who are going to have sufficient speech skills to get and to be able to talk in a way that's going to be able to be understood all the time in an educational setting. So even though it might be a nice skill to have, and for some kids it's going to be an effective skill to acquire, certainly not one that we can anticipate that all deaf kids have. As I said, my kids, that's just not a skill they have. It's kind of like my musical ability. I would be probably a better person if I had musical skills, but as anybody who knows me knows, not so much. So it just isn't happening. And kids who are just in a normal setting, meaning no sign language at all, just using speech and lip reading, they still have significant language delays. Even if they get cochlear implants, even if they have speech therapy, it's just not the same as the kind of language access that many hearing people have. Whether it's because that cochlear implant isn't on 24/7, if it didn't start before birth when they were in the womb, whatever, we just know that those language skills are there. And the evidence that says that oral methods work best, it's still kind of, there's just not a lot there that really says that any one thing is best, which is probably the one single best lesson, is that there isn't a one solution, one size fits all is definitely not the answer. Just so we're clear, this is not saying that the average is, it's not the mean, but in 2000, 50% of deaf and hard of hearing 18-year-olds read below the 4th grade. So we know that there is significant English literacy delay for kids at 18. What do we know about cochlear implants? It doesn't really make any difference which one you buy. Sorry, no, actually, I don't work for any one of the companies. They all seem to work about as well. For most deaf kids, they seem to help some. They can be valuable, they can be useful, even if all they do is tell you that there's a horn honking or that there's something going on and around, so you're just kind of a little bit more conscious of some of those sounds. And kids who are who wear a cochlear implant pretty consistently basically look like severely hard of hearing kids. They don't look like hard of hearing kids. The couple that you see on television or they can hear for the first time. Typically those tend to be a fairly narrow group and not really reflective of generally how most kids are who wear cochlear implants, which is obviously an ever-increasing population. Those kids function and act more like kids who are hard of hearing, severely hard of hearing. So what do we know about cochlear implants? They require a lot of work. They're not a put it in, you're done. It requires a whole team of working together. We know that the use of sign language does in no way minimizes the impact or the effectiveness of cochlear implants, and that kids who have cochlear implants still have pretty significant language delays, language delay in speech, in reading, in all of the different domains that we're looking for. They're not really stuck between worlds, sort of deaf and hearing. Increasingly, many deaf people, many deaf children who are now, of course, as children. So, what do we know about cochlear implants? Of course, perhaps the most obvious thing is cochlear implants are a lot of work. They're a lot of work for the whole team. The audiologist, the surgeon, the speech pathologist, the teacher, the child, the parents. Everybody takes a lot of work. A lot of energy. It's not something you just kind of turn on and you're done with it. We know that using sign language doesn't negatively impact on the cochlear implant's success or its effectiveness. In fact, if anything, what we do know is it seems to help. That most children who have cochlear implants still have some pretty significant language delays and language and speech delays. But at the same time, these are not deaf kids who are stuck between hearing and deaf worlds, they're hard of hearing kids, as we said earlier. And often they will choose to identify themselves either with the deaf community or with the hearing community. But just having a cochlear implant doesn't make them hearing or make them part of the hearing world. And as near as we can tell, and obviously another one of those hot topics, is that the cochlear implant doesn't have any particular psychological impact on children positively or negatively. So what we do know, what works, is that language. Surround the deaf child with accessible language. Give them the opportunity to, however they get it and provide it. Encourage parents to use their sign skills and know, of course, that the kid is probably going to be ahead of many of the parents in learning sign. Warn them ahead of time. That's okay. Even if they're still catching up to the kid, at least they're providing that opportunity, that contact. And yeah, you're going to hear and read and see all kinds of things saying this is the right answer, that is the right answer. There isn't an answer. There's a lot of questions, and just be cautious and go with what the kid does well. So what we also know is that deaf children don't understand as much language as we might like them to, as they think they do, as we think they do. Again, Mark Marshak up at NTID in Rochester looked at kids who are in classrooms, and we know that kids who use ASL seem to do a little bit better than kids who use signed English, but they both don't do quite as well as kids who can hear. And this is classes taught by people who are native speakers of English, or users of ASL, or users of sign English, so that it's not a question of the language competency of the instructor. These are not through interpreters. These are direct one-on-one or one-to-a-group classroom instructions. But it does seem that it may just be a little harder to acquire, structure, remember the information that's provided through that one piece of it. So all of that being said, kind of putting that behind us, what do we know about disfluency? Now, you're going to see me talk about DIS, disfluency. That's something we're going to sign as not fluent. And then you're going to hear me talk about disfluency, DYS, which is kind of a disrupted fluency. Now, disfluency happens all the time. I know if I look at the transcript of this webinar, I am going to be saying and right, doing all those sort of bad things we're not supposed to do throughout my presentation. And then actually what we know is that that actually helps comprehension, saying that we hear things better if we get those little pauses, whether intentional or not. So, you know, a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old, deaf or hearing, is DIS fluent. They don't yet have the language fluency. So we're not really talking about this in this presentation. What we're going to be talking about is language disorder. For those of you who are DSM-5 and ICD-10 folks, there is a language communication disorder. And for the general population, that's about 2%, which isn't very many. But what we know for the deaf population is that it's a fair bit higher. Neil Glickman, who's in one of the other seminars on the series, did some research at the inpatient facility, and obviously these are individuals with some pretty significant challenges, but in that population, about 75% had communication disorder. They were disfluent, DYS. These are not individuals who are just in the normal learning process. They're not 1 or 2 and still trying to figure out how to use language. These are individuals who are adults, who don't have language that's commensurate with their cognitive skills. They should have better language than they do. So Bob Pollard up at the University of Rochester kind of uses this graph to look at that sort of, yeah, it's not a bell curve for those of you who are better at statistics than me. It's not a, it's obviously a one-tailed thing. It's shifted down to one end, that for most hearing individuals, they are fluent in their language of choice, no matter what their language of choice is. Obviously, there are people who are eloquent, not me, but there are folks who are you know, they're actors and politicians and all of those most politicians, who are eloquent in their use of whatever language they're using. What we know is that certainly there are deaf people who are eloquent in ASLs. You look at somebody like Peter Cook or Clayton Valley, poets who just take the language and do gorgeous things with it. Unfortunately, that curve is shifted down. So yeah, you have that this end of the scale, those folks who are really fluent in language, who just really have got it going on. But then you also have a lot of people who are fluent, but the bulk of people are proficient because of these challenges in language acquisition. And so really we're going to be focusing on that population of individuals who have some type of dysfluency. The language disorder, and it's important because it gives you something to call this lack of fluency. And it used to be DSM 1, 2, 3, and 4, for those of you who can remember the Rainbow collection of books, that there were persistent, that if you were deaf, you couldn't make some of this diagnosis because it said language disorder, and so even though it wasn't because they were deaf, it was because of it still looked like it was a rule out. But it's very clear in DSM-5 that persistent difficulties in the acquisition and use of language across modalities, whether spoken or written or sign language or whatever, due to deficits in comprehension or production, and that includes reduced vocabulary, it includes limited sentence structure, impairments in discourse, taking turns, knowing what the rules are for making that transition from you talking to me talking. So when those things are present, then we can diagnose a language disorder, and that they are substantially and quantifiably below those expected for the age. So obviously, we don't expect the same from a 2-year-old as we do from a 6-year-old, as from a 12-year-old, as from an 18-year-old, but we can make that diagnosis at any time. If you have a 2 or 3-year-old who's not babbling, they have a language disorder. This isn't to say they won't grow out of it, but they're not on par with what we expect of a child, deaf or hearing, at 2 or 3. If you have a 6-year-old who doesn't yet have an expressive use of, as we saw in one of the earlier slides, where we see at 4, we're expecting them to be using ASL grammar. If they're not there, they're behind, and they are substantially and quantifiably below what we expect for a 6-year-old. And then obviously it moves up. So if you've got an 18-year-old who's not able to have a conversation about everyday life and tell you about what's going on, and whatever it is that 18-year-olds talk about, and it's the father of 6 children, one of them who's 16, I sometimes do wonder exactly what they're talking about. Different question entirely. But that results in functional limitations in effective communication, in social participation, in academic achievement, in occupational performance, and all of the different venues where we use language. And it's also important to understand that we're talking about, to make for this diagnostic category, we're talking about that failure, that delay happening early on. This is not somebody has a stroke and loses, it becomes disfluent, certainly, but they don't have language disorder. They have stroke. they have whatever is the language resulting from that. But this is, we're talking about something that starts from birth or before birth, and they are delayed throughout that process. So when we see that developmental delay, we can make the diagnosis of language disorder. So what does cause it? How does that happen? Well, obviously, mental retardation would cause it. Now, when I understand when I'm talking about the language disorder here, at this point I'm not talking about the diagnostic category, because the diagnostic category is for their age and cognitive capacity. So language disorder is the diagnosis wouldn't be because of mental retardation, but at the same time somebody who is mentally retarded may also have some disorder of language. Developmental disability, not the same thing, but that you can have different challenges to the acquisition of knowledge and thus the acquisition of language. You can have aphasias. Deaf people are not immune to having aphasia, immune to having that part of the brain that's supposed to produce speech or sign language. Doesn't make any difference which the expressive language is. You can still have an aphasia that affects that part of the brain. You can have a stroke. That clearly causes some challenges to language. In fact, some of the most fascinating work you're ever going to read about related to strokes was done with deaf people. What the Hands Reveal About the Brain by Ursa Belugi. Just fascinating work looking at deaf people who had fully functional language, fluent in ASL, then had a stroke, and then we can look and see what happens left and right. What parts of language do they lose in a way that we can't study with hearing people because spoken language is not spatial in nature. So it's much harder to kind of tease that out. So if you really want a fascinating read, go look at what the Hands Reveal About the Brain and what that tells us about stroke. And then we can see which part of their brain, and then we can tell which part of the different pieces of spatial structures get impacted by a stroke. You can clearly have dementia. You can have schizophrenia, you can have schizophrenic dementias. You know, people have schizophrenia as they get older will develop a specific kind of dementia. You can have Alzheimer's, the most common type of dementia as far as I know, where individuals, as they progress in the disease, will have challenges with language. Again, it's not the diagnostic category of language disorder, but it's still a disorder of language. You can have Wernicke's from long-time alcohol abuse. If you see somebody who has been intoxicated for many years, they will have some pretty significant impairments to their use of language. You can have a physical disability which impacts your use of expressive language. If you have cerebral palsy, it will affect your motor skills. And if it affects your motor skills, using sign language, which is a motor language, it will impact their ability to be understood. So it's important that you know what kind of etiology is there. Charlene Crump down in Alabama has done some great work looking at the different etiologies and how that impacts the different process of language acquisition. But if you know somebody has cerebral palsy, clearly if they've got the athetoid type of cerebral palsy where their hands are curling in, that may impact their ability to sign some things clearly and understandably. You can have somebody who has a motor tic. You know, if they're losing that control on an involuntary basis, it again may impact their use of language. I work for the Department of Mental Health in my regular line of work, and what we also know is that psychosis can have some pretty significant impact on language. And again, independent of whether you're deaf or hearing, psychosis is still going to impact your language. So it can impact grammar. You may have people who have inconsistency. They may use American Sign Language and then use Sign English and change back and forth without any sort of good grammatical reason to do so. We do know that sometimes when people are talking about classroom, they may use more signed English. When they're talking about church, they may use more sign language. Whereas if they're talking about a social or athletic activity, they may use more ASL. Those kind of things are part of the language, and we see that as people coach, switch. When they're talking to hearing people, they may use more signed English. But that inconsistency, without any of those linguistic reasons, can be part of psychosis. They may just have inappropriate grammar. They may, you may ask them a question like, what's their name? And their answer may be, and now you're lost, because there doesn't seem to be anything to do with any language that you knew. You can rarely have somebody who has some sort of perceptual difficulties where they may not be able to see certain things, or maybe perhaps you get the opposite. They are actually seeing things that aren't there. One way or the other, those perceptual difficulties are going to affect their language use. Within sign formation itself, we have, in the same way that we have with hearing people, you have clanging, meaning my Whereas for hearing people, these things rhyme. So you have, somebody who ends every word with ing or starts every little word of a sentence with t, 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 whatever it is. In sign language, we see that presented as using just one hand shape. Maybe they give an entire sentence like. So the hand shape stays the same, and this seems to be the same process as the rhyming that goes on with hearing people. You have neologisms, which I assure you can really make an interpreter's life very difficult. This is where somebody comes up with a sign that is not a standard sign. So somebody might tell you this, and you can turn to your neighbor if they know sign language and ask them, and it will not help you because it's not a sign. For this particular client, it meant they had a computer in their nose. So that means that sign was something they created, and it's not a standard sign. You can have perseveration, where somebody starts signing something like, I want to go home, and then they just repeat that sign on and on and on, much longer than is linguistically appropriate. So all of these things, that you can have stereotypy, which not only do you see in psychosis, you also see sometimes in individuals who have autism, where they may just. So in addition to those sort of challenges which psychosis can produce, you also have somebody may be hearing voices, whether they're deaf or hearing. The process of psychosis is the same. So you might see somebody who says something like, you might ask them, why did they do something? And they might answer, well, now we don't know exactly, of course, what they're thinking or if they think they're talking to somebody. But sometimes, because ASL obviously is a physical, visual language, if somebody is telling a story, it might look like this. So that same body shift can sometimes be confusing to somebody who's not fluent in sign in trying to figure out, is this part of the normal narrative use of ASL and the use of space to communicate using the language, or is something else going on? So with all of those things together, again, it's extremely important that if you're interviewing somebody and trying to figure out, is it dysfluency because of psychosis, or is it because of a language disorder, or is indeed it is not dysfluent, but it is merely the normal use of ASL, you have to be sure that either you have that fluency or you're working with a partner, either a deaf interpreter, a CDI, or a hearing interpreter, both of whom are trained in working in mental health. People can be illogical. You can ask a question and you can get an answer. As I showed earlier, you ask, what's your name? A pretty basic ASL question, and the answer you get back is, you can have people who have disorders of discourse. They are not clear about their communication, so they may start out with, you might ask them, why did they go to the store? And they start to tell you that they got up in the morning, and then they went to the bathroom, and then they had cereal, and they explain to you a whole group of things. Now, for many hearing people, that may appear to be circumstantial communication. But in reality, it may be, depending again on the individual, it may be the narrative form of ASL where they're telling you a story to provide you with the context, because ASL is a much more context-rich language. They may be giving you all the pieces of context they think you need to know. So sometimes when I'm working with a hearing clinician, they may tell me something like, no, we don't want all that, just tell them to answer the question. And that actually, of course, is a violation of one of the rules of ASL. So that can be a problem. You may also have people who are tangential. You might ask a question and off they go over there. And again, it can sometimes be difficult to tell, is that tangential because they didn't understand your question, or they're not sure how to answer it, so it's a disorder of language, or it may be something coming from psychosis where they are responding to that internal thought. So if you ask them a question about, why did the police bring you here? And they say, well, the police came and they have blue lights and I like blue and the house next door is painted blue, but I don't know why they use paint, why they don't use siding. And of course there's different kinds of siding, and again, you can have very tangential thought process from psychosis, but you can also have what might look like a tangential question or tangential response to a question from somebody who has language challenges and didn't quite understand the question. So again, working either if you have the fluency yourself or working with a team who has that to figure that out. So we've looked at a wide variety of different causes of dysfluency, starting with the developmental. What I really think is probably the significant and the distinctive piece of working within the deaf community, where you see individuals who, for a wide variety of reasons, come to your setting without possessing the language fluency that we would expect for somebody of that age and that cognitive skill. We know that this dysfluency can come from a lack of exposure to language, whether it's a visual language or an auditory language, whether they're using sign language or they're lip reading. What we know is that for many deaf children, and then of course, because children become adults, deaf adults, we're going to see dysfluency. We're going to see a lack of basic communication skills because of all of the different things that we've looked at that result in that child or that adult getting to you without having sufficient language skills. And that needs to be assessed as a standalone piece, not part of their cognition, not part of their IQ, not part of whatever learning disability they might have, but just do they have the language skills that fit their age and their cognition? And then, of course, you then have to take that and the high likelihood that they're going to have some type of developmental dysfluency, just because sadly deaf children are not born into an ideal world any more than hearing children are born into an ideal world. So even if they manage to accomplish that task, which again is probably not too likely, so you're going to be looking at not just one cause of dysfluency, but many, you can have individuals who have a cognitive delay or developmental disability. You're going to have individuals who had aphasias and strokes. You're going to have individuals who have dementias, whether they be Alzheimer's or Wernicke's or from schizophrenia. And then you're going to have the kind of individuals that I work with most of the time who have a dysfluency because of psychosis. So all of those things together need to be teased out, and we need to look at the language piece as much as we can developmentally, independent of all of the other things that are coming later on. And so again, that's going to take working as part of a team with somebody who has the language fluency, ideally somebody who is a native user of sign, and somebody ideally again, which you may not have access to, but in the ideal world, let's postulate that you have the ideal world where you've got somebody who also has mental health training and is able to help you kind of tease that out. There are formal mechanisms to assess that. We use something called the communication skills assessment. There are different checklists to try to figure out if somebody's on par. Gallaudet and the Clare Center at Gallaudet has developed some normative measures to assess whether a child has developed the necessary ASL skills. So all of those things are things that can be done formally. And then, of course, last, it's important to not overlook the importance of culture in that whole conversation. Mr. Holcomb, in his presentation, I know has talked about that. But it's important to understand that anytime you become fluent in any language, whether it's sign language or Spanish or French or whatever the language is, that when you have that, to know a language requires knowledge of the culture. You can't fluently speak a language. You can't really understand a language without knowing the culture in which it's based. So learning the language requires learning the culture, and vice versa. Learning the culture also requires learning the language. And then it's also important to recognize, Edward Sapir, who's a linguist, looked at how we view the world, and recognizing that whether we want to go back to the original slides and try to figure out where does language and where does thought come in, we do know they interplay with each other, even if they are two separate entities, as Chomsky has postulated, but that no two languages are ever so similar that they really construct the same social reality. That how you understand things, how you think about things, which way you store and retrieve information in your brain affects the social reality in which you live. So again, it's essential when we're trying to do this language assessment and trying to figure out what disfluency is, that you have an understanding, at least at some level, of the culture that they're coming in. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope that this webinar and the whole series of webinars is helpful to you.